good morning and welcome everyone to the launch of the EMCDDA and Europol in-depth analysis of heroin and other opioids. Thank you so much for joining us. We've got a huge variety of participants joining this morning, so thank you so much for giving up your time for this. So we are here today to present this joint analysis that draws on the information from the EMCDDA's drug monitoring system and from Europol's operational information on serious and organized crime. We take a threat assessment approach, highlighting key areas for action at EU and member state level to respond to the developments. This module is the latest in a series of online resources on EU drug markets, and you'll find all the material that will be presented today online. If you scan the QR code that's on the screen just now, it will take you directly to the landing page. This morning, we'll take some time to guide you through the module, presenting some of the details, but please note there is a lot of information and additional information online, and I encourage you to browse through it and interact with the data at your own convenience. All of the data-driven figures that you'll see are interactive online, and you can download the data if you wish to use in your own presentations and learning resources. So for a long time then, heroin has been the drug associated with the most drug-related harms in Europe. That situation appears to be changing, and potent synthetic opioids are becoming a feature of the drug market in some countries and changing these dynamics. In this report, we take a deep dive into the topic to explore questions such as, what are the latest changes in the EU opioids market? How are global geopolitical developments impacting supply? Are heroin routes changing? And to what extent do synthetic opioids pose a threat to Europe? The analysis is based on triangulation of data from multiple sources, and it largely relies on reporting from the EU member states, and we are extremely grateful for the collaboration of our partners and our various networks of experts working in the EU member states and beyond. And many of those experts are tuned in to this webinar launch today. We will have 4 speakers presenting the content this morning, and I will introduce each of them before they speak. And after all the speakers have finished, we will have some time for questions. So I would please ask you to put your questions in the Q&A window rather than in the chat, because that will be quite difficult to manage. Before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to make a short note about the specific terms we use in this report. We use opiates when referring to natural or semi-synthetic drugs derived from the opium poppy. So morphine, codeine, and heroin are referred to as opiates. We use opioids when we're referring to drugs that have effects similar to the opiates, typically synthetic substances, many of which are highly potent, such as fentanyl and its derivatives, or the so-called nitazene opioids. So our first speaker this morning is Teodora Groshkova. Teodora is a scientific analyst working on markets, crime and security at the EMCDDA. Teodora was the lead author on this report, and she is going to take us through the global context and how Europe's market for opioids is becoming increasingly complex. Theo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Good morning, Paul, and thank you for joining us for this webinar to launch the heroin and other opioids module. I would start with a brief global introduction.
Theo, can you just adjust your microphone closer to your mouth because it's a little bit quiet?
Can everybody hear me? I'm coming through loud and clear. Next slide, please. in terms of the global overview in which we view the developments on the European opioids market, I would note that the global estimate by the United Nations UNODC for 2021 showed that there were around 60.4 million non-medical users of opioids, of whom around 31.5 million were users of opiates, mainly heroin. The highest estimated prevalence of opiate use was in Southeast Asia, standing at 1.1%, which was double the global average at 0.6%. I will shortly turn our attention to the European opioids market and look at some of the developments which occur. And I note here that these developments in Europe occur in the context of two ongoing global opioid epidemics, that of illicitly produced fentanyls in North America and tramadol use in North and West Africa, the Middle East, and Southwest Asia. Now, in the EU, heroin continues to be the most commonly used illicit opioid, and it's a significant contributor to the overall harm related to illicit drug use in the EU. However, as noted earlier by Andrew, and the analysis identifies the details around that, the landscape of Europe's opioid problem is evolving and growing in complexity. And we will come back to that later with more detail. Opioids, mainly heroin, often with other substances, were present in around 74% of the over 6,000 fatal drug-related overdoses in 2021. At present, fentanyl and its derivatives appear to contribute only a small share of the overdose deaths, drug-related overdose deaths in the EU, linked to around 130 deaths in 2021, of which 88 were in Germany, but potentially greater concern is posed by new synthetic opioids, in particular the nitazenes. Heroin remains the third most commonly reported drug in acute drug toxicity presentations in hospitals in 2021, accounting for 15% of the reported cases. In 2021, around 1 million adults were estimated to be high-risk opioid users in the EU. And those estimates are relatively stable in a number of individual countries in the EU. In terms of the financial impact of this market, based on 2021 data, we estimate, using an established methodology developed by the EMCDDA, that this market was at 5.2 billion euros. This is a minimum estimate, and that corresponded to around 140 tons estimated to have been used in 2021 by users. Next slide, please. Turning to the overall opioids market, this is increasingly complex, as we noted earlier, with a range of synthetic opioids, fentanyls and its derivatives, predominantly used in some of the northern and the Baltic states, but also a number of other synthetic opioid medicines, including methadone, buprenorphine, oxycodone, typically diverted from legitimate suppliers. Now, worryingly, there are signs that new synthetic opioids, such as the nitazenes, some are hundreds times more potent than heroin, are more available in parts of Europe, particularly in Estonia and Latvia, but also visible in some of the latest overdose data contributing to those deaths identified to be related with nitazenes in Norway, Finland, and Sweden as well. These new synthetic opioids are relatively cheap and easy to obtain. And increasingly, the mis-selling or adulteration of established opioids with these potent substances appears to be increasing. And this in turn causes increases in risk of overdose and can cause outbreaks as well. Now, these changes are likely driven by supply factors, including a possible disruption of heroin supply to the European Union in view of the significant reductions of opium cultivation and production in Afghanistan, an important topic which we'll discuss later on in this webinar. In terms of price and purity in the European Union in 2021, and looking at trends, also index trends indicate that the average purity of heroin rose by 38% between 2011 and 2021, while the price dropped by 16%. In most recent data, we see slight increase in the average price, and it's falls in the purity, with half of the EU countries reporting average purity in the range of between 16 and 24%, and a mean price in the range of 24.45 euro per gram in 2021. Now, there are likely to be several factors related to both supply and demand, of course, that explain why prices have been declining overall in Europe. Among the key factors I would highlight on the supply side, the sustained global production and supply driven by the high opium production in Afghanistan up until 2022. But that, as we will discuss later, changed dramatically in 2023. So potentially fluctuations in price and or purity indeed could be anticipated down the line. And with that, I hand over to you, Andrew.
Thanks a lot, Teodora. It's particularly concerning that we see these potent synthetic opioids being used to adulterate the heroin supply. And I know this has been picked up through the EU early warning system mechanism and reported to the EMCDDA from several EU member states. And we also know that this is taking place in the United Kingdom and some other places as well. Okay, our next speaker is Laurent Laniel. Laurent is a principal scientific analyst here at the EMCDDA, working on markets, drug-related crime, and drug supply reduction. And today, Laurent is going to talk about what is going on with the cultivation of opium poppies and heroin production in Afghanistan. And he will also touch upon some production activities here in the European Union. Over to you, Laurent.
Thanks, Andrew. Good morning, everyone. I'm just waiting for my, okay, yeah, here you go. So yes, as probably most of you know, big news this last year now is the drastic 95% estimated drop in opium poppy production, but opium on this slide production in Afghanistan. This follows the Taliban takeover and a ban that they issued in April 2022. And so obviously this raises question as to what is going to happen to the markets where the heroin from this opium was used. And so what I also want to tell you, and I was almost forgetting, is that this 95% drop results in 2023 in estimated 333 tons of opium being produced in Afghanistan, as opposed to 6,000 tons the previous year, and the years before that, around 6,000 tons every year. So in 2023, only 333,000 tons, which translates in between 24 and 38 tons of export quality heroin, 50 to 70% pure heroin. as opposed to in previous year between 350 and 580 tons of heroin. So really, it's going to be a significant, something really significant affecting global opiates in this case, but opioids as well, market around the world, and particularly for us in Europe. Now, the big question, of course, is will this ban hold? And I don't have a crystal ball. Nobody does. It's quite difficult to know whether it will hold or not. But the factors listed on this slide should definitely be taken into account when trying to understand if the ban will hold or not and what's going to happen. So, will the Taliban be able to maintain this ban, where we know they are complex and fragmented group of people, as is the country of Afghanistan itself? Whether and how they will enforce the ban when they are really under very serious economic pressure because of an AIDS freeze from most of their international partners, and a very, very serious economic crisis and humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. Also interesting to take into account is the fact that it takes about a year for the opium poppy to be the opium to be harvested from poppies in Afghanistan until heroin reaches the streets of Europe. So there is a lag. So how will this affect the supply to Europe when even in 2023 next to no heroin will be produced? It may take a while for us to actually feel the effects of the ban. It may not be immediately in 2024 or in 2025 even. We'll see also how organized crime networks who've been in this business for a very long time. It's one of the longest standing, probably, drug chains in the world, if not the longest standing and in history. How they will adapt, what will they do to address disruptions that they may feel down the line later on. Of course, let's see how this translates into our market, whether there will be more adulteration of heroin, and adulterated with what, potentially with synthetic opioids, as was already mentioned, whether there will be a shift to synthetic opioids and heroin will disappear, as occurred maybe 15 years ago when there was already a drought in Europe and some countries stopped having heroin and switched to fentanyl. Will people turn to other substances as well as opioids, including methamphetamine and crack, or switch entirely to other substances? This should definitely be on the back of our minds when now assessing the impact of this ban. I'm trying to change the slide, but yes. Sorry, can I go back? Yeah. Well, we mentioned obviously we are European Union agencies, and we are particularly interested in Europe, but we also need to understand that before the opium or heroin made in Afghanistan reaches us, it goes through transit countries. Probably the most one of the most important of which, with Turkey, is Iran. Iranian also organized crime, as you will be told later on, I assume, are also quite involved in supplying the market. And you can see here, I attract your attention, of course, on the big orange columns, which reflect the opium seized in Iran. We know that Iran is not a major opium producer. Afghanistan is, and probably all or most of this opium that is seized in Iran comes from Afghanistan. You can also see some seizures of morphine. Iran has traditionally been the country seizing the largest amount of morphine even before Afghanistan. All this to say that we will see how these figures are affected once the ban actually hits and bites into the trade. These amounts of opiates, namely opium and morphine, although there is a market for opium consumption in Iran, probably indicate that some heroin or some morphine at least is manufactured in Iran. So the production of heroin from the Afghan opium is not only taking place in Afghanistan, but also in Iran, and also, but to an unknown extent, to Pakistan, where I could show you a broadly similar slide with slightly lower figures of seizures, but we also think that Pakistan is a heroin producer. And again, some Pakistani criminal groups are involved with the market in Europe. So we'll see how they react also to the ban. Now turning, of course, to the chemical product without which there would be no heroin, or so far there wouldn't have been heroin, the acetic anhydride. Basically, the headline here is that Europe continues to be a significant supplier of acetic anhydride for heroin manufacture in Afghanistan and in the other countries along the trafficking routes. Although less was seized in 2021, as you can see on the graphs here, both in the numbers on the right and in the quantities seized. In 2020 and 2021, a lot less was seized than in previous years, but precursor seizures tend to vary widely. There are cycles of seizures where, for reasons that I cannot explain always, except that perhaps law enforcement concentrated particularly or were lucky on certain years, the seizures fluctuate quite a lot. But also, I mean, a lot less was seized in recent years, about 50% less, 106,000 liters, down from 152,000 liters in the previous period. What are the factors explaining this? Was probably reduced diversion attempts and trafficking, the emergence, which is a trend that we need to keep an eye on, the emergence of an alternative chemical to acetylate the heroin or the morphine into heroin, which is acetyl chloride, and a shift to alternative trafficking routes, which may not be as well policed as the traditional ones, particularly the Balkan route, where acetic anhydride is trafficked from Europe to Afghanistan, often via Turkey, while heroin is trafficked from Afghanistan to Europe, also often via Turkey. We are producing some opiates in Europe, but it's relatively rare, has been so far, and we hope it's going to stay that way. You've seen some labs have been taken down where smallish quantities of heroin were produced in Germany, in the Netherlands, and in France. I have to say that the figures mostly reflect cutting and packaging facilities where heroin is mixed with mostly paracetamol and caffeine before being sold on the trafficking chains down to the users. And that 15 sites, such sites, were dismantled in Europe between 2018, sorry, and 2021. In the Netherlands, particularly, 3 sites were processing morphine into heroin. We have some intelligence gaps here. We don't know exactly the size of these labs or where the morphine was coming from. The morphine could come from opium poppies grown in Afghanistan, for example, or elsewhere, or it could come from diverted stocks available to pharmaceutical manufacturers in order to make medicines. So this production has been going on for a while in Europe, and continues, but apparently at low level. For your full information, I should also mention the fact that there are small amounts of opiate drugs for injection or for ingestion manufactured in Central and Eastern Europe have been tradition, and this also goes on. Probably the most known one is the so-called kompot from Poland. Apart from heroin, there are also other opiates, which are difficult to qualify properly, to name properly, except for the street name like compound that are made in Europe. And the big one that everyone is scared of is illicit synthetic opioid production in Europe. You all know about fentanyl, I assume, and there are also other candidates. Nitazines were mentioned earlier, and basically the message here is that production of these things, not necessarily trafficking, but production, is marginal in Europe. There is no sustained synthetic production of opioids. We rarely find labs manufacturing them, especially fentanyl. You can see on the slide a few seizures. The last one was made in Latvia in April or May 2023, where 5 kilos of a mixture containing fentanyl and carfentanil was seized. So 5 kilos these days doesn't sound very high, but it is high when we are talking about fentanyl, which is highly potent opioid, and 5 kilos can turn into a very large number of individual doses. So marginal phenomenon so far, but there is potential in Europe, and we have to really keep a close eye on the manufacture of synthetic opioids within Europe and the EU, because we are significant synthetic drug manufacturers already. So there is an infrastructure existing in Europe to manufacture synthetic drugs illicitly. These drugs are manufactured not only because there are people knowledgeable about manufacture and equipment available, but also access to precursor in Europe seems to be has continued, has allowed people to manufacture drugs like amphetamine, ecstasy, methamphetamine for a very long time. There are established global trafficking networks of people who can supply precursor and export drugs manufactured in Europe to around the world and within Europe. And finally, we know that Mexican criminal networks, Mexican cartels, as they're known, are present in Europe. They have been caught in partnership with European criminals, manufacturing large quantities of crystal methamphetamine, particularly in the Netherlands. And they as well are also involved in the trafficking of cocaine and the processing of cocaine on European soil. And as probably everyone is well aware, they are probably the largest supplier of fentanyl, of illicit fentanyl, to the US market. So we need to really be careful and pay close attention to developments in the production of synthetic opioids in Europe. And I give the floor back to Andrew. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Laurent, for covering this important part of the presentation. The developments in Afghanistan are really significant, and we haven't seen developments like this since around 2000 and 2001, when we had the last ban of opium poppy in Afghanistan. And we know at that point, as you mentioned, that there was certain disruption to the heroin markets in Europe, and some EU member states even lost their heroin markets to the point that it didn't quite recover. So this is an important period for the EU monitoring centre. It's important for Europol and all the networks that we have, all the networks that we interact with. We are all alert to this. We are looking out for signals of changes happening in the heroin and opioid market. And it's worth saying that we are noticing some indications, as was mentioned in by the previous speaker. You have some adulteration of heroin using synthetic opioids, and perhaps this is the first indication that there are some changes taking place to kind of prepare for some market disruption in terms of heroin itself. So that's quite an interesting concept, and we'd like to hear your views on that, and questions please in the Q&A tab, not in the chat. Okay, so moving on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Robert Patrancus. Robert is a scientific analyst working here at the EMCDDA on drug-related security matters, mainly in covering the Western Balkans. And Robert is going to mainly discuss heroin trafficking routes and changes in supply modus operandi, but we'll also highlight some of the new opioids entering the EU drug market that have been mentioned already, based on largely information coming from the EU early warning system on new psychoactive substances. So Robert, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. I'm pleased to be here today to speak about trafficking of heroin, in particular about the seized heroin in Europe, the complexity and the particularities of the heroin routes, and also heroin's movement within the European Union. On the screen, there is a chart displaying the evolution of number of seizures in the EU, Turkey and Norway during a decade, 2011-2021. The overall number of heroin seizures in EU, and please note the dark blue line on the chart, fell by about 40% during the analyzed period. However, this decline is registered from a quite high baseline, as in 2011, the number of seizures reported in the EU were at their highest level recorded, over 31,000 seizures. As you can see on the chart, the number of seizures remained quite stable until 2015, gradually declining thereafter, reaching less than 19,000 in 2021. If we include in the analysis also Turkey and Norway, please note the light blue line on the screen, we see that during the same period, the situation is relatively more stable, with two peaks in 2015 and 2018. Despite this decline of number of seizures, the quantities of heroin seized in the EU more than doubled in this period, from 4.2 tons in 2011 to 9.5 tons in 2021. In fact, the 2021 quantity represents the highest amount seized in the last 2 decades. This indicates that now larger quantities of heroin are trafficked in individual shipments, and it is possible also law enforcement prioritization of wholesale interdiction over retail interdiction. Additionally, a record quantity of 22 tons was seized in Turkey in 2021, bringing the total quantity in EU, Turkey, and Norway to almost 32 tons that year, which also represent a record. Based on preliminary data, Turkey seized less than 8 tons of heroin in 2022, which represent a substantial decrease. So for 2022, we expect an overall decrease. Historically, the trafficking of heroin to the EU from Afghanistan and neighboring countries, Iran and Pakistan in particular, has been concentrated along a few established routes. Balkan route, which is still important but changed, Southern route, which increased in importance, and Caucasus and northern routes, which were directly impacted by the war in Ukraine. The routes are often interconnected and traffickers often combine them. Also, the routes are impacted by various factors such as globalization, for example, improvement of transport infrastructure in general, including the maritime containers. Another factor is the law enforcement actions that prompt traffickers to adjust their routes and methods in response. And good examples are the law enforcement operations based on intercepted encrypted communication. Also, as it was already mentioned, unexpected events may affect drug trafficking, such as COVID-19 pandemic, the Taliban taking over of Afghanistan in 2021, the opium ban cultivation in 2022, and of course, Russia's war on Ukraine started in 2022, if I remember correct, in February. In the next slides, I will provide some details about each route. On the screen, you see two maps. On the left side is the Balkan route, and on the right side is the southern route. The Balkan route from Afghanistan through Iran, Turkey, and the Balkan region represents the shortest and most direct route for heroin to European markets. Important, it is also a corridor for acetic anhydride in the opposite direction. Law enforcement information identifies Iran as a significant hub for heroin along the route, where heroin is concealed in legal cargo or hidden in vehicles. Bordering two EU member states, Turkey is another key country on this route, being transited by large quantities. Nevertheless, as previously mentioned, in 2022, Turkey registered a serious decrease of seized heroin. As a key gateway to the EU, Bulgaria is very important for this heroin route. However, similar to the seizures in Turkey, recent reports from the Bulgarian Customs Agency indicate an 80% decrease in seized heroin, dropping from 1.1 tons in 2021 to only 200 kilos in 2022. There is possible a shift of the Balkan route. There is a possible shift of the Balkan route southward. Criminal networks transported heroin to Turkish ports on the Mediterranean Sea, where ferries and cargo vessels go to the EU ports. For example, in October 2021, Croatian police seized 220 kilos of heroin in the Adriatic port of Plose, concealed in a cargo of lead ingots on a ship arriving via Turkey. Over the past decade, the southern route importance for the EU market has grown. This route goes through Iran or Pakistan, from where heroin is transported by traditional sailing vessels known as dhows, or it is concealed in maritime containers. Three branches are identified within this route. The first branch transit through the Suez Canal, mainly reaching ports in the EU or Turkey in containers. It's important to mention that this branch has seen increased activity since 2021. The second branch uses the free trade ports in the Arabian Peninsula as transshipment points. For example, heroin could be offloaded in the United Arab Emirates. An important case were registered recently. And the third branch uses ports in Africa along the east coast, the Swahili coast, and South Africa, and sometimes is combined with inland routes. Why do we have this increase? Cost effectiveness of this modus operandi. Larger quantities can be transported in single shipments. Possible perception of less strict borders on this route, and extremely important, using multiple transshipment points along the route makes more difficult the law enforcement risk analysis and detection. On the screen, there are the routes that were directly impacted by the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which basically has changed the trafficking landscape in the region. Heroin trafficked on the northern route appears to be destined mainly to consumer markets in Central Asia, in Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, but also some EU member states, particularly the Baltic countries and Poland. Significant heroin seizures have recently been reported along this route. Example, 400 kilos seized by Kyrgyzstan in 2021. However, EU member states rarely seize heroin trafficked via this route, even though a proportion of the heroin may eventually enter the EU. The Caucasus route usually involves heroin being smuggled through the Black Sea to Bulgaria, Romania, or until recently Ukraine. An important storage and transshipment point for heroin on this route was Ukraine, but the disruption to maritime trade in the Black Sea has diminished the practicality of trafficking via Ukraine. A significant amount of heroin is smuggled in containers to EU ports, and in some cases, it is intended for the UK market. On the screen, there is a map with examples of large maritime heroin seizures in the EU during 2019-2022. Along the maritime route, there are transshipment points where heroin could be moved from a container to another, concealing the real origin of the transport. Such transshipment points are in the ports of Africa, Iraq, Pakistan, Turkey, United Arab Emirates, also in countries on the Black Sea or Adriatic Sea, and not only. The Netherlands remain a hub for distributing heroin to EU markets, including for the maritime shipments using the southern route. Notably, a major seizure of 2.6 tons was made in 2022 at Port of Rotterdam, the trafficking route being via Africa, Sierra Leone, Morocco, Netherlands. The heroin shipments can also go directly to EU ports. As example, in 2022, 700 kilos of heroin from Iran was found in a maritime container at Hamburg port, destined for distribution across Europe. Several important seizures were made in ports of Adriatic Sea, in Slovenia, Port of Koper, and Croatia, Port of Ploče. Also, the Black Sea ports have been recently used, and I will speak more about them in the next two slides. The United Arab Emirates appears to have emerged as a hub for money laundering, criminal coordination, as well as for heroin transshipment to Europe, and possibly a storage point. Since 2021, Bulgaria and Romania have reported large consignments of heroin in Black Sea ports via the United Arab Emirates. As example, on the screen, there are photos from a seizure of 400 kilos of heroin concealed in rolls of bitumen. The trafficking route was Iran, United Arab Emirates, Bulgaria, and Belgium, and the seizure was made in February 2021 by Bulgarian authorities in Port of Varna. Important to mention that United Arab Emirates is a transshipment point also for acetic anhydride. As example, in 2020, Iran reported a seizure of 14,000 liters of acetic anhydride misdeclared as paint. The shipment was destined for Afghanistan and shipped from United Arab Emirates. Another case example occurred in May 2021 when Romanian authorities intercepting over 1.4 tons of heroin in 2 containers loaded with marble tiles that arrived in the port of Constanța via the United Arab Emirates. The criminal networks behind this shipment had established a complex logistical and legal infrastructure and used EU-based companies. The trafficking route was Iran, United Arab Emirates, Romania, Belgium, and Netherlands. Once smuggled into the EU, heroin is then distributed to consumer markets across all Europe. Various data sets, including data provided by World Customs Organization, RILO Western Europe, identify for the period 2018-2021, the Netherlands, and to a lesser extent, Belgium, Bulgaria, France, and Germany as important hubs for intra-EU heroin trafficking. Based on the available data, these countries are most frequently reported as origin or transit points for heroin shipments seized in other EU member states. Notably, during 2018-2021, almost 1,000 seizures of heroin destined for an EU member state were intercepted in mail consignments, including from express couriers. Most of the seizures were reported to have originated from the Netherlands. This points out that this method is important for intra-European trafficking and also highlights the Netherlands' role as a heroin distribution hub. And the last slide from my side, it's about the new opioids. New synthetic opioids are well established in some European drug markets, and in some cases, they are sold as replacements for heroin. Based on submission to the EU early warning system since 2009, the system is monitoring 78 new synthetic opioids, of which 38 are fentanyl derivatives and 13 are benzimidazoles nitazines. As you can see on the chart, benzimidazoles are recently the most notified synthetic opioids to the system. In 2023, 6 new benzimidazoles were reported for the first time to the system. The market for synthetic opioids in the EU is supplied by medicines diverted from the legal market and by synthetic opioids produced outside the EU that enter Europe through key logistic hubs. Typically, these substances are shipped anonymously in small quantities via freight forwarders or postal or express courier services. Darknet markets, e-commerce, and social media platforms are also exploited by sellers. Thank you so much for your attention. Andrew, the floor back to you.
Thank you so much, Robert. A lot of detail in your section of the presentation, so thanks a lot for that. I would encourage the people who are more interested in that content to visit the section, the specific section on the online content, because yeah, we're only really scratching the surface during this short presentation. Thanks a lot for that. Okay, so now it's the turn of our colleague from Europol, and is Tiberio Stoyan. Tiberio was a former colleague of ours at EMCDDA, and he left sunny Lisbon to join Europol in The Hague a couple of years ago, and is currently an operational analyst focused on drug matters, drug-related crime and organized crime. Tibi will be concentrating on the criminal networks involved and the enablers in heroin trafficking. So, Tiberio, if you're ready, over to you, please.
Thank you, Andrew. Hope that you can hear me. I'm glad to be here. Welcome, everyone. So I'll start my presentation. Let me see if I can move the slides. Okay, it seems that it's working. So yeah, I'll start with the first part. So it's really important to have a good picture of the heroin markets, because we want to minimize the negative consequences of the heroin supply. And to achieve this, we need to tackle the criminal networks that are engaging in heroin production and in trafficking into EU and within the EU. And now I will present several elements relevant for understanding the criminal actors that are involved in the heroin trafficking. And I will also look a little bit at the enablers of this profitable business. First, what we can see it's that in terms of the most prominent features of the criminal networks involved in the heroin trafficking, is that they are really well established along the trafficking routes and in the key hubs outside and inside the EU. They are also business oriented, they are cooperative, and they are adaptable. They work together to supply the drugs, to organize the shipments, and they make sure to ensure the distribution. And occasionally they also share their profits by doing joint ventures. And these criminal networks, they have a wide geographical scope with members that are spread along the trafficking routes and in key hubs from production towards the distribution inside the EU. They are also in many cases, especially within the EU, they are poly-drug traffickers, and they will deal not only with heroin but with other drugs, and they are also from time to time, depending on the case, do swaps between heroin and other drugs, including synthetic drugs or cannabis, for example in Turkey, or cocaine in Western Europe. And beyond this, there are some criminal networks that are also engaging in other types of crime along with trafficking of heroin. For example, trafficking in human being, it was noted in heroin criminal groups. Also, there are groups that engage in migrant smuggling or firearms trafficking. And wanted to highlight this operation that was supported by Europol, that was also mentioned by Robert, in which in total more than 2.4 tons of heroin was seized in various countries, and this represents uh, the features of the criminal networks, because uh, the the drugs were heading to Netherlands, but the Turkish organization was active in many countries in Europe, and in total, several logistic infrastructures were dismantled, 13 criminals arrested in countries in Netherlands, in Poland, in Turkey, in Belgium, including some high-value targets that were also arresting during this operation. So this clearly points out to the futures of the criminal networks. With regards to the main actors of the criminal networks, we have noticed that there are some differences, mainly influenced by the size of the operation of the networks and the geographical scope. And at the top of the pyramid, at the wholesale level, where the big quantities are smuggled, criminal networks are often connected by established trust and ethnic ties. Here, Turkish, Kurdish networks, they control a vast network of legal business structures that are spread along the trafficking routes, include in various EU countries and in the transit zones. They rely on their operation on community and language connections. They find in their network collaborators. They enable operations in various countries and in the trafficking along the trafficking routes. In the middle level, we have a greater variety of nationalities involved in trafficking in the EU or towards the EU. And this mostly depends on the location of the trafficking hubs and also on the routes and modi operandi employed by the criminals. And I give here some example. For example, in Dutch networks, we see the involvement of this network in the Western Europe, and they are distributing here from the trafficking hub towards Western European heroin markets. Also, we have Western Balkan criminal groups that are active mainly in trafficking within the EU and in some EU countries. They are polycriminal usually, and they are more active on Balkan route. African networks also continue to play a role in the trafficking of heroin, especially from the African hubs. They are using mainly the air courier, as they are known to be specialized in air trafficking, and we are noticed that they are more active in the southern route. And on the low trafficking level, we notice that distribution is mostly done by local criminal groups, although other nationalities have been also noted in the course of the investigation, like Western Balkans mentioned, the Africans or other East European networks. Okay, and related to the roles employed by criminal networks, we also see a separation between the levels of the trafficking, and as many other criminal activity, heroin is also similar to a business enterprise with specific activities allocated to individuals. The roles we see here in the trafficking are driven by the business needs of the organization and also by the scale of the operation, both in terms of geographical scope and the complexity of the trafficking. So there are different individuals either within the network or externally commissioned that are responsible for different tasks in several stages of the trafficking and in different locations. For example, in production, we see brokers or supplier for heroin and for acetic anhydride. We have noticed chemists or other technicians that are working in processing facilities. But this, except the trafficking and diversion of acetic anhydride that is taking place in EU, this type of roles are more noticed closer to production regions. Then we have heroin brokers and suppliers that operate in key hubs along the trafficking routes, and they link together the producers with distributors. And they also get involved some other trafficking members. And in the mid-level, we have other types of roles: organizer, logistic facilitators, retail distributors that are operating in this area. And except this, we have a wide range of other actors that are engaging in several parts of the trafficking process. And I want to highlight here some other roles, for example, drivers, couriers. There are experts in building special concealments for heroin. We have document fraudster, money brokers, collectors, or money mules. So we need also, we'll discuss about the profits, and we need this to transfer the money. Strawmen, corrupted individuals that will support the network to carry out the activities. So a wide range of roles that are active, play a role in the trafficking of heroin. And to fully understand the heroin criminal network, it is important also to highlight the enablers of heroin trafficking. And on this slide, you will see some of the enablers: the legal business structures, the criminal finances infrastructure, document fraud, corruption. These are some of the main enablers of heroin trafficking. So criminal infiltrate and set up a legitimate business to misuse them in order to carry out activities, legal activities in parallel with drug trafficking. They do this firstly to cover the illegal activities and to launder money, but also to increase their profit. The trade and transport companies are used to move the drugs, to store them, and also to recruit human resources or for arranging the logistics. Criminal finances, so profits from heroin trafficking are believed to be collected primarily in cash. So to move them, criminal use cash-intensive businesses. They also use money laundering techniques or underground money transfers, such as hawala or more sophisticated methods. And here in this, we would like to point out that United Arab Emirates, also mentioned by Robert, has emerged not only as a transshipment point for heroin, but also a hub for laundering illegal profits obtained by the trafficker. And similarly to the reverse Balkan route, it's also used not only for the precursors transportation, but also to move the profits back to the production region or to the location where the leadership is located. About fraudulent documents, they are also essential for operations of heroin trafficker. And just give some example here. For example, fake identity documents used by lorry drivers, bill of lading, CMRs that declare legitimate goods as a cover load for the heroin shipments, or fake employment contracts and other documents to establish fake business records. So a wide range of fraudulent documents that are used by heroin traffickers. And of course, this is also really important, corruption, that because considering the complexity of the operations and the wide geographical scope, heroin trafficking is not possible to be carried out without support from the corrupted actors. So the criminals target both public and private sector for corruption, and mainly they are targeting key areas like border crossing points and ports to infiltrate and to manage to carry out their operations. Related to violence, particularly at the wholesale level, heroin trafficking, as said before, is a cooperative business and rely on long-lasting trust and knightship. And this, because of this, violence is not common at this level. But we should point out here, because it was already mentioned, because in the event of major disruption of this supply chain that may happen in the future, the violence may grow in this area, and because of the growth of the synthetic opioids on the market, for example, and violence may emerge, particularly among the new player that will want to take over some parts of this market. That is all from my side. Thank you. Andrew, I'll give back the floor to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Tibi. That's really a great addition to this presentation. Clearly, the joint analysis that we do together with Europol makes the whole report much richer and adds a dimension that we can't add to this without the operational information from cases and from intelligence and from all of the work that Europol is doing. Time is against us, so we're going to move directly on to the next and final speaker. So we're returning to Teodora, who will guide us through the actions that we've come up with together to address the current threats and increase preparedness in the EU for these heroin market and opioid market changes. Over to you, Teodora.
Thank you, Andrew. I was going to cover very briefly just the key points from this analysis, just to sum it up for everyone who's following this webinar. And indeed, very briefly, heroin continues to be the most commonly used illicit opioid and is a significant contributor to the harms of illicit drug use in the EU. But as we discussed, we are increasingly seeing an evolving opioid market, increasingly involving synthetic opioids and new synthetic opioids with high potency. Importantly, the drastic political changes in Afghanistan and the significant reduction in opium cultivation and production in this country, which is the main source of heroin consumed in Europe, may significantly disrupt the market. We discussed the seizures and their reductions in 2022 compared to 2021, which noted a record quantity of seizures. and a decrease in heroin availability in Europe, I need to note here, could lead to market gaps, which could potentially be filled with indeed synthetic opioids, but also, as previous speakers noted, synthetic stimulants and other drugs introducing the further complexity to drug users. And each of these drugs essentially also has an impact on the public health and security. Notably, there are changes in trafficking patterns with greater emphasis on the exploitation of maritime routes, including global container trafficking, and the number of countries the UAE was singled out do play a key role as a transshipment zone. Europe continues to be a source of acetic anhydride for heroin production in Afghanistan, though seizures and stop shipments have shown a decline in recent years. Turkish criminal networks continue to dominate the wholesale trafficking of heroin to the European market, although other criminal networks were discussed, including those from Western Balkans region and others which are involved and have a role in cooperating with suppliers in the producer region and other partners to supply heroin to the EU. Due to the stability of this market, of the opioid market in Europe, established criminal roles and also cooperation among criminal networks, which were discussed by our colleague from Europol, the level of violence that we observe currently appears to be low, particularly in comparison with the levels of violence we see, for instance, on the cocaine market. But this can potentially change and the situation could escalate if there is disruption to the market. We identify a range of actions which Europe would need to take in a concerted effort with member states and other partners, and so to address the threats, security and health related threats, which are posed by the opioids market. We group these into 5 areas, and they relate to the improvement of the strategic and intelligence picture. I would like to highlight here the need to strengthen the EU preparedness by enhancing the capacity to rapidly identify and respond to emerging health and security threats in the opioid market. Also, strengthen the responses to reduce supply and enhance security. Strengthen international cooperation, continue investing and maintaining working relationships with our international partners, but also invest in capacity building, and importantly, strengthen the policy, public health, and safety responses. And of particular importance here is the need to continue developing and further investing in evidence-based set of health and social responses, building on the lessons learned from the past and engaging a broad range of stakeholders, including people who use drugs, and learn from their lived experience. With that, I hand over to you, Patrancus.
Thank you so much, Teodora. So we're finding ourselves at the end of the formal part of the webinar, the presentations. I'd like to thank all the speakers for preparing for this content and preparing the presentations. I'd like to open up for a few questions. We've been receiving a number of questions in the chat. In the question and answers tab. And we have tried to answer some of these as we're going along. And some of them were actually posed before some of the presenters had given their inputs. So some of the questions have already been answered. But turning to some of the questions that I think we can deal with now in the short time that we've got left, I'll take the first one, and it's about methadone salt. Can panelists explain methadone salt, which has been seen in Eastern European countries? What is it? Is it diverted methadone, an NPS, a synthetic opioid? How is it administered? Any other information, i.e. on its origin? Now, this phenomenon relates to the illicit production of the synthetic opioid methadone, and this appears to take place in the Baltic region. We've got instances of laboratories being found in Latvia over, well, I think there was one maybe in the last couple of years, and then before that, a few years before that, we had one laboratory. So that's not a particularly new phenomenon that's just come up. It's not a recent thing. It's not very common. Methadone is a very potent synthetic opioid, and of course, when it's used pharmaceutically, it's used in very small doses. But the illicit production sites that have been found in the EU are relatively small, and they're not very common. So that's the information we have there. It's produced as a salt form, and so it's supplied as a powder into the drug markets, mainly in the Baltic countries. So switching to the next question, which I'm going to give to Laurent, and it's in relation to the drop in the cultivation of opium poppies in Afghanistan. And the question, well, two questions actually. What country or area could take over from Afghanistan? And as a follow-up, is there any truth to an increase in heroin production in Myanmar, which could fill the gap caused by the Afghan ban? Laurent, could you take these two questions, please?
Yes, I'll try to do my best. It's a bit difficult to predict the future, but taking over from Afghanistan is unlikely to be the job of just one country. I mean, the history of opium production in Afghanistan is very long. It's back to the Russian invasion and the measures that were taken against it. It's a very long-standing phenomenon in a country which has become very poor, was affected by several armed conflicts, wars with foreign people inside the wars, and internal, etc., etc. And so trying to compensate for such a big drop in the largest producer by a very long shot is unlikely to be the job of just another country somehow deciding. Of course, the business is not centrally controlled, so this would imply several actors in a particular country saying, oh yes, let's produce massively more poppies and produce heroin from them. I doubt that's likely to happen. If opportunities, the drop in production may well create opportunities for other producers around the world. Myanmar is potentially a candidate, being identified as the second largest producer of opium, of illicit opium, at least in the world. But the Myanmar production is oriented towards Asia and Oceania, but mostly towards Asia. So shifting this and producing a lot more to also supply the European markets with new supply lines, more or less, that would be established, is a bit of a long shot, I think. But maybe some increase in Myanmar will take place if the ban in Afghanistan holds long enough for allowing for other producers and exporting networks to adapt. Another potential candidate for taking over at least some of Afghanistan's production would be countries in Latin America. I mean, Mexico's a significant producer of heroin. Heroin is also produced in the Andes, in Colombia, in Peru, in Central America, in Guatemala. All these countries are already linked to Europe through cocaine and sometimes methamphetamine trafficking networks and infrastructure. So potentially they could also come in and fill a gap. Pakistan used to be a large opium producer in the past, could maybe in some regions see a resurgence, although this to produce to the infrastructure needed to grow large amounts of poppies takes several factors, including the availability of a population that will have little or no other alternative, or that is being kept in somehow in conditions that make it more viable to grow poppies than to grow another crop, which would be less cumbersome to grow, less difficult to grow, or less dangerous to grow, because there's significant risks attached to illicit production. So in short, very hard to see how this could be compensated even in the medium term by any single country, and even if production of heroin was growing in what we already have identified as producers, it would likely take quite some time to fully, offset the loss, if you like, of opium resulting from the drop in Afghanistan.
Thanks, Laurent. And it's probably, obvious, stating the obvious, but clearly Myanmar is now the global leading producer, we think, of opium, and this has been recently published by UNODC in their most recent survey report, which I think the link to that report has also been mentioned in the chat. If I could move on to a linked question related to this, to our colleague Tiberio from Europol. Tiberio, how do you think Iran and Pakistan will seize this opportunity? Can you elaborate more on state involvement in these two countries and also organized crime networks operating from there?
Thank you, Andrew, for passing this question. So our most recent information, it's from December. These countries have not seen any reduction in trafficking from Afghanistan towards these countries. So they still seize really large quantities of heroin and also methamphetamine. We didn't discuss about this during this module, but you know that Afghanistan is also producing large quantities of methamphetamine. So these two countries, they are all still seizing large quantities of heroin coming from Afghanistan. We have seen reduction in Turkey, but this is further along the routes. We don't know. They also don't know what to be expected from Afghanistan, but they said that they are prepared to fight against the trafficking, and maybe we will see maybe a possible shift in the production in these two countries, but it is too soon to be discussed at this point. And yeah, still there are stashes of heroin in Afghanistan, so there will be some more heroin in the market at least this year, and then we will see what will happen.
Thanks, Tibi. And you lead a little bit into the next question that I'd like to post to Robert, please. Robert, there's a question in the chat, in fact, several questions on this theme, which are really about how much heroin is in the supply chain, really. So the question is there any established data on heroin stockpiles along the trafficking routes? Back in 2000, 2001, what was the time lag between the halt of Afghan poppy production and the drought emerging in European heroin markets? If you could take that one, please, Robert.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, that's a very interesting question about the stockpiles, and a quite tough one. I will start by my answer by mentioning that probably all drug analysts would like to have data on heroin stockpiles, which I think is very challenging. I mean, such data would definitely bring a lot of information on criminal networks operandi. There were law enforcement operations that indicated existence of stockpiles in different countries, but an established data or someone collecting routinely data on this, I'm not aware of. I'm not aware of this, at least I am not aware of this. Many countries along the route are also storage places, but this is mainly for short periods. They store the heroin in different location where they change the direction, they change the container, or they put the drugs in other trucks. However, about routine data on stockpiles, I'm not aware of it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Robert. There are quite a few questions in the Q&A box posed by journalists, and could I please ask that if you're a journalist asking questions, could you please put these questions through the press office, because we won't have time. We're running out of time just now, and we'll have more opportunity to answer these questions separately in a follow-up. If you just put the same questions through the press office, we can answer you directly through an interview or something like that. I don't want to spend too much more time in the webinar. We only have a couple of minutes left, and we really need to wrap up. It's clearly a very important time in relation to heroin and opiates and opioids and what's going on in the EU drug market. Some of the complexity that's been introduced into this market is really going to challenge the services that are available for drug users in Europe. As we know, Europe has a fairly stable opioid using population, and these people will not just stop using that type of drug when the heroin disappears. And we know this through historical precedents that have been set with 2000, the original ban, with the shortage around 2010 as well. So we know about this, we are prepared for this, we are raising awareness with all of our partners on this issue, and this webinar is part of that awareness raising as well. We've raised important points in the actions to increase preparedness and counter the threats. And so I think we're probably at the most important point in history in relation to the heroin market in Europe, as we have been for the last 25 years or so. So I'd like to encourage you to please dig into the data that we have in our report, read the analysis that's there. It's rich, it's well structured, and if you have any questions about it, please get in touch. I apologize, we haven't had time to go through all of the questions posed in the Q&A, but we just simply are running out of time. So I'd like to close this webinar by thanking all of the speakers and all of the colleagues at the EMCDDA and Europol and the EU member states and our partners in the EU and outside that have made this the production of this module possible. And thank you for the support team that have made the launch possible as well. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you at the next webinar. Thanks a lot.